Welcome to Data Leadership for Everyone. I'm your host, Anthony Algman. Everyone needs to harness the power of data. There's a lot involved in making that happen, and this show is here to make it all a little bit easier. Think of this as an audio advice column for all your data and leadership questions. Our guest today is Sean Falconer. Sean has a lofty goal to make the digital economy safer, and he's doing so one API at a time. A former competitive programmer, entrepreneur, and expert storyteller, his many accomplishments include designing the software used to create ICD-11 at the World Health Organization, founding Proven.com, and leading developer relations teams at Google. He's also one of the co-hosts of Software Engineering Daily and the sole host of data privacy and compliance podcast, Partially Redacted. Sean, welcome to Data Leadership for Everyone.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks, Anthony.
So we were chatting a little bit before we went live on the show. And it's just, we can't get enough of ChatGPT and AI and all of these things that, generative AI has really captured people's attention and imagination. And I'm really curious, from your perspective, what are some of the things that we might want to be thinking about that maybe haven't been topics that we've covered before, the natural things that people gravitate to?
Yeah, I honestly, like, when... for myself, when these kind of hype cycles in technology come up, I'm kind of like, whoa, I don't know. Like, I was super late to being like a smartphone adopter. I was, of course, super early to the internet, but with things like crypto and blockchain, I was never really into that, even though there was, a huge amount of hype around that in the last couple of years. And originally, when everything was starting to come out with ChatGPT, I was like, I don't know. I saw this with like Alice a decade ago or maybe it was even longer ago, 15 years ago with Microsoft. Just like, people are getting a little bit, crazy with the hype right now. But then, and I even did an episode on Software Engineering Daily where I think I was not necessarily down on the technology, but I was a little bit like, hey, let's not go crazy here. This is not necessarily the revolution that everyone's talking about. But as I've actually started to use ChatGPT and explore generative AI more and more, I'm like on the other side of the fence now. I've been convinced that really this is the next sort of big change in the way that people interact with technology. And you see these transformations that happen in the tech industry every decade or so. Even, you go back to like mainframes, to desktop computing, to the home internet, to then the smartphone. And now I think we're on this new sort of path of essentially AI. And that's going to be the thing that every company, every consumer is just used to using in some capacity for quite a while. So I'm very excited about that. But that being said, I think that there are a lot of challenges to figure out, a lot of things to navigate. Just like there is in any sort of new type of technology that's coming out. Like, you think about Napster, for people who were around when Napster came out in the late 90s, and this idea of essentially being able to suddenly digitally download music. Every consumers loved it, but essentially the government and also the music industry took a long time to even understand what was going on there and then sort of react to it. And then there was like an overreaction in some respects. And I think we're kind of in the same place when it comes to these generative AI technologies. We've seen, for example, recently, Italy temporarily banned the use of ChatGPT. Samsung also had a ban on the use of ChatGPT for a variety of different reasons. It really comes down to concerns over privacy and security. And I think that's one of the big central challenges that everybody who's interested in these technologies needs to kind of start to understand and get a hold of, especially if you're going to be building anything in this space.
Yeah, there's so many things that we can talk about. And one of the things that we have talked on the show about is the quality of AI being dependent on the quality of data. And certainly there's still a tremendous number of data challenges in many organizations. But I think that's well established. But one of the things that I'm thinking about now, in light of what you were just talking about, is like, we hear about like that consortium of people who have encouraged that we stop developing AI until we can regulate it more, which is a pretty extreme thing for that kind of innovative group to say. I'm curious, your thoughts on that particular news bite that has certainly raised eyebrows, and then two, what might that regulation, or what kinds of regulation should we actually create from your vantage point?
Yeah, I think it's unrealistic that the speed of innovation is going to stop. Essentially, like you're not going to be able to put a hold, I think, on innovation, especially when there's so much potential like money involved with people being able to create products that really change the way that people do their jobs essentially.
Yeah.
I just don't think you can really hold that back. And even if you were able to hold that back in one particular country, it's not going to be able to be something that is all over the world essentially. And then you run into the situation where are you impacting innovation with your own country that's going to cost your country down the road, while some other country essentially is like, hey, let's just like go full in on generative AI and these other technologies and win the race to whatever that looks like from a technology perspective.
Yeah, just to jump in on that, though, it's like it's a pretty classic prisoner's dilemma problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's I would love for my competitors to take 6 months off, but I'm probably not going to. And certainly if I don't think they're going to, then I'm not going to. And so like it very quickly resolves to a place where clearly nobody's going to stop innovating, even though they say we should. So
yeah,
I
and I think in terms of regulations, so I want to preface this that I am not a lawyer,
nor am I.
Yeah, so please take this with a grain of salt. But I think when we look at other types of regulations that exist around the handling of credit card information, the handling of healthcare information in the United States with like HIPAA compliance and so forth, like compliance really has so far been like a baseline for companies to adhere to from a security perspective and privacy perspective. So, if you're sort of building for compliance and building to comply with regulations, you're probably only hitting that sort of baseline metric. You're behind the ball in terms of really preventing things like data breaches and data leaks like that. The people who are sort of penetrating systems, taking advantage of different companies' weaknesses in their security and privacy posture, a lot of times most of those companies are compliant. They're not out of compliance when those things happen. So I think when it comes to data security and data privacy, we shouldn't be waiting anyway for the regulatory bodies to say like you should do this. We should be doing these things because it's the right thing to do, and that privacy is a fundamental human right, and we should be doing the right things for our consumers. If you look at the steps that Apple has done as a company, they've really led in a lot of ways as a like sort of privacy first company, and it's a big part. I'm sure they have it helps from a marketing perspective as well, but it's a key differentiator when you're using like an Apple product. They're putting privacy out there as a key differentiator, and they might be doing it for marketing reasons, but they're also, I think, doing it because they believe in those things as a culture of the company, and they're trying to protect their the consumers of their products from having these types of challenges where their data is being taken advantage of. And that hasn't been the case really over the last 20 years. We've been in a place where I think we've kind of been in this cowboy Wild West era of data where we haven't really thought about why are we collecting this information? What are we doing with it? Do we have the right controls and data protections in place? We just kind of collected it because we could. And then when these kind of problems arise where we end up with our consumer information getting leaked, then we kind of retroactively go back and like try to lock it down. But a lot of times that's too late to make the right changes to solve that problem.
Well, this is a whole terrifying kind of notion, because are we on a path? And one might argue that it was bad enough with the internet and like tracking and ad stuff and privacy concerns around our individual data. But if you amp that up, turn it up to 11 with the AI behind it, and are we just waiting for it to get so bad that finally a company with a shred of altruism like comes in and says, "Hey, maybe we went too far here. Let's rein it back a little bit." Like that's probably not a good idea, right?
Yeah, I would hope that we've learned from some of our mistakes. There very recently there was a huge fine that Meta just received, the 1.3 billion euro, and I think they're in a place where it's very difficult for them to fix some of the fundamental problems that they have from like a privacy perspective, because they built their product now over 15 years ago, and they scaled that massively, and they weren't thinking about these types of things, necessarily the protection of the data. And certainly GDPR hadn't been even in existence when they were sort of starting, but it's kind of hard to unroll and like work back whatever sort of architecture that they've built as a product to even comply with things like data residency requirements and there's more and more of those going around the world. But Now, when it comes to like, we should be more aware at this point that this is a thing that we need to navigate and understand. But at the same time, the whole nature of how things like GPT models work is completely different than anything we've really encountered before, because it's not like, essentially, once an LLM learns, it can't unlearn. There's no
Mm,
row of information to delete. So even something like, oh, we accidentally got someone's personal information into the model, how do you roll that back? Like, there's
right.
just, you can't even do it. At least, it's hard for businesses to delete information today about a user because it essentially gets spread everywhere. But conceptually, they understand what is involved with doing that. Like, let's go track down all the places where this user's information is, all the backups, the log files, and we will delete that row of data. With an
Hmm.
LLM, it's like 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 there's no way to do that. There's no way to essentially just delete that information. There's no way to unlearn it.
Well, it seems like a corollary to the issue around provenance of where the AI got its assertion from. Like, how do you track back to the particular places where it learned?
Right.
Because at some point, it doesn't even know how it learned. It's just like a human says, "Well, where did you learn that?" My kids are great examples. Like, the kids come back and they start talking about something. I'm like, "Where in the world did you learn that thing?
Mm-hmm.
How did you like?" That isn't something that gets covered at school, and then all of a sudden that happens. They don't know. I don't know where I learned it, but like, you
Yeah.
learn these things, and AI is going to be no different. It's going to be really interesting how we unravel that, because you see very clear regulations in things like GDPR about, the right to be forgotten and all that stuff. Well, what if the thing can't forget anymore? So that's a huge issue. The other thing that this scares me as well, kind of tying this to what we were talking about with the Apples and the companies that are finally saying, like, okay, we need to make some adjustments. It's kind of terrifying also to say, all right, we need to explain this to like legislatures and the legal system, and how they need to make rules around this. Like, I know for a fact, like, a lot of the people that are in those kinds of roles don't even do email very much yet. Like, that's
Yeah.
how are we going to explain this stuff to them and expect to get good regulation around that?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, I think even if you look at the, from when like the Google proceedings happened and stuff like that, and them trying to explain how, search works to Congress, that was a very difficult conversation to have when you're potentially talking to people who have really no technology knowledge, let
Yeah.
alone something as complicated as essentially a neural network. And I think even as an industry, like, I go to these different events and everyone's, excited, of course, around the potential generative AI, and everybody, the entire industry, is like reacting and scrambling to try to come up with like, what is our plan for AI? But at the same time, even the people in technology don't have a deep understanding of what's going on right now, and even people who have deep expertise in neural networks, like, they can't necessarily explain why a model is producing the things that they do, because it's just so complicated. There's so much math that's going on, and so many like cycles of essentially building that model, fine tuning the model, like you were just talking about the source attribution. Like, the model doesn't know, the scientists or the people who are essentially behind the design of the model, of training it, they don't necessarily know how all these things work as well, because you're basically solving this really, really huge complicated function with billions of inputs. Like, there's no way that a person can kind of like map that to understand, okay, well, this is what I put this input in, this is what the output is going to be. It's too complicated for someone to kind of have within their understanding at one time, let
Mhm.
alone then go and try to explain it to people who have no grasp or understanding of what it's actually doing.
Huh. So it's super complicated, and yet I can't help but come back to say as you were talking about that, I found myself thinking about, all right, data science, right? Data science is comparatively, in this case, I'm thinking of like people who come up with fairly advanced algorithms, but still writing them programmatically, versus AI, which is just another level, right? But if
Mhm.
I think about data science, and one of the biggest challenges that I've seen with data science is that you find really interesting stuff in data science all the time, and you may even reach some really interesting conclusions or some interesting recommendations. However, I think where data science has failed the enterprise or the organizations out there a lot of time in terms of their strategic relevance to the success of a business is that taking what that data scientist does and turning it into a viable business model is a very difficult thing to do. And I'm of two minds on this, and I'm curious where you land. Is that on one hand, I see, well, with AI, it's going to be more of the same. We're still going to struggle with that same thing. But then the other side of me says, but maybe this is exactly what AI solves, is that while it doesn't address the can you versus should you dilemma, it does help you very quickly connect things that a data scientist struggles with in terms of taking the abstract and connecting it to the very literal or the very operational business model, versus the AI might be able to say, I'm going to root everything in what a viable business model is, and then I'm going to do analysis that's entirely based on that. And that's where I think, is this potentially solving that challenge that we've historically seen in data science? I don't even know if I made sense in what I just explained, but tell me what you think.
Yeah, so if I understood that correctly, I think the challenge you were saying about data science is it's hard sometimes to connect the insights to a viable business, essentially.
Yeah.
I think the things that AI is really good at is essentially solving like optimization problems, and because it can essentially take in way more inputs than a person could potentially sort of like process. So if you can essentially distill the problem down into like, here's all the like variety of inputs that I want this to be taken into account. And I want to be able to figure out by, tweaking each of these inputs up and down some, fraction, running that billions of times essentially, and figure out what is the optimal sort of model that leads to some version of success, then that's what AI is really excels at. And if you look at something like GPT, what it's essentially doing is figuring out, based on billions of inputs, what is the next word in like the best word essentially, and then to appear next in the sentence. So it's an optimization problem. So if you can distill things down into an optimization problem, AI is very, very good at that. And I think what from like a business sense, I think maybe connecting the world of data science to the world of creating a business case for it, I think where things like GPT can potentially be good at is it becomes essentially like a brainstorming partner for you, just like it does when it comes to writing or anything like that. You can essentially feed it different inputs, and it can come up with a variety of suggestions that, even if they're not necessarily on the money, they might steer you in a direction where you're like, oh, right, maybe this is the idea. Because the whole thing is, we become very used to a certain like way of thinking, even a certain pattern of speaking and writing and so forth. And it's really hard to kind of break out of that without having, some third party, a friend or a colleague kind of come in and be like, why don't you think about it this way or try this? But even then, if they are, have a similar background to you, work in a similar space, maybe they have the same job function, they're also going to be siloed in some way where they have, they're basically closed off to different ideas. And the advantage of something like AI is it doesn't care like what your professional background is. Like, it can essentially take in data from all over the place, which could be a way to essentially create suggestions and ideas that help you break out of this mode of thinking, and also even like from a writing sense, adapt the way that you write, because it's not going to, maybe it can hit the tone, but it's not going to use the exact same words and phrasing that you've written maybe thousands of different times. So it can kind of make you create a situation where you have more variety, and then lead you to a path that maybe you wouldn't have thought of yourself.
Yeah, I like that from a corralling perspective. And certainly people are naturally, once something works, you tend to do it again. And that leads to patterns that are hard to break out of, right? And
Yep.
that, I think, is definitely something that AI could do. And what I'm also thinking is like, well, talk about something it's so literal that it can say, like, if I have a certain resource constraint, like even something that's very broad, like language, right? Like there's only so many words that exist, and that those can be input into the system to then be a constraining effect. And once you can constrain it somehow and provide certain parameters, AI can reduce that much faster than a human can. And so I see a lot of potential there for being able to suss out things while still respecting constraints. So if it's, and as I kind of come back to that question around the data science side, is that what data scientists often lose is sight of what are the resource constraints in my actual organization, and how do I filter that into my analysis, because I don't know what where that analysis is going. I'm pulling on threads, but I have
Hmm.
no idea what happens until I've pulled that thread enough to see, now I see what's going on. There's no way we can do this. The AI could do that, but a billion times faster. And then rule out the ones that it clearly finds are not good. So it can pull so many threads so fast, it can quickly home in on the ones that are worth further exploration. I think that's really a powerful, especially with where the sophistication of these things are today. I think that's a very good tool, as it's a tool. It's not a complete solution at this point, but it will help a human do what a human does best by amplifying the things that a human doesn't do well. Would you agree with what I just said?
Yeah, I think that's right. Like we don't do like super large scale analysis well,
Mhm.
but that is something that computers and also AI does very, very well. So it can sort of fill in the gaps of some of our, the places where we're not as successful, or we're not as naturally good at. But you, it doesn't mean that it solves all the problem. I think there's a lot of things that the human essentially domain knowledge, contextual knowledge also needs to be taken into account. That's why I was saying that you can essentially use something like ChatGPT or other generative AI models as a way to sort of ideate on an idea, but it's probably not going to necessarily nail the ultimate idea that you need, but it might lead you down the path where that you weren't thinking about before, and provide essentially a suggestion that is interesting to you, but it requires you to be able to recognize that based on your context and based on your
Mhm.
domain knowledge, to be like, okay, yes, this is the right one. But I hadn't thought of that before.
Yeah, it's kind of that the 80-20% rule, like where you've got it'll get you most of the way, but not quite the entire way. Like AI is notoriously bad at like social cues. Like it doesn't know when something is just wildly inappropriate for things that it just didn't know. It's super, super literal. I've called it like it's ultimate in book smart, but not street smart a lot of
Mhm.
time, because it can learn through its observation of other experiences, but that's a little bit different than experiencing it yourself. And that's one thing that AI can't actually do. It can observe, it can infer, but it can't actually experience. And so I think you have to, and I imagine that for all time we're going to be always, there's going to be some link that AI can't do quite as well as a human. I think that'll continue to shrink, but today it's probably 80-20. 5 years from now it might be 99-1. I don't know, but it's definitely where I don't think it's possible to fully replace the humans, but can it? Like, you know better than I do.
I think I see it more as uh, the having the potential to essentially make people 5 to 10 times more efficient than they
Mm,
previously were. At least in what I'm seeing now, and even for the foreseeable future. Like some of the fundamental things that I think some of the GPT based AI and writing systems are doing is solving essentially like the blank page problem. So it's like I need to write an abstract for something, or I need to put together a blog post, or I need to summarize a podcast, or whatever it is. And if you're like, I'm not in a creative mood, I'm not thinking straight, I'm tired, it can spit something out, and it's probably not going to be perfect, but then you can sort of massage it. It's much easier to take something and edit it into the version that you want than
mhm.
to essentially start from scratch. So I see it a lot as something that is going to make people efficient, and I think we're going to see similar things. We're already starting to see this with programming as well, with like GitHub Copilot, and I know a lot of people are starting to also use things like ChatGPT to help them write code. And if you can solve so much of programming is a lot of just like pushing and pulling data. It's a lot of like repetitive tasks. If you can take that off someone's plate by having AI essentially fill in all that boilerplate, that frees people up to be thinking about deeper problems. And it not necessarily replaces them, but it transforms their sort of skill set. Suddenly, maybe everybody who's engineering in some period of time in the future, they're more playing the architect role of how do I sort of connect these different pieces together to create something that's unique and valuable. It's hard for AI to do that, but they can essentially supply a lot of the boilerplate code that today, for the most part, is being written by humans.
Yeah, great point. I mean, I think about when I'm doing consulting, right? Like, and you're doing a workshop, you're much better off throwing out your best idea, even if it's terrible, but give people something to react to other than just a blank sheet of paper or a blank whiteboard, because it's hard to get that going, and AI can really propel that. Clearly, I mean, any kind of um, accelerator like that would be very useful. So even as a consultant, like, there's things that you could do to just help facilitate the natural human process, and that's a big win just there. I mean, how could your workshop become twice as effective? Yeah, I think it
Mhm.
could if you're starting with, hey, ChatGPT came up with this. Well, how do you react? And go from there. I think you save yourself an hour. So
Mhm.
definitely good. So in the last minute or two that we have, just what's exciting to you right now? Like, you feel like a person who, like, gets out of bed, loves doing this stuff all day long. Like, what is the thing that you first think about in the morning? Like, what is the thing that you're most excited about in this space right now?
I think for me, like the big thing that I'm really excited about the is this like digital interaction shift that I'm seeing. Like it
Hmm.
feels like a paradigm shift in terms of how people are going to interact with technology. It reminds I went to high school in the 90s, and that was sort of the introduction to the internet at home.
Yep.
And I would just remember, even now, even though it was like 25 years ago, how excited people were, and also sort of like scared or confused about what was going on at the same time. But there was just so much momentum and excitement over that, and businesses were like scrambling to figure out, like, how do we get online, how do we adapt to this suddenly connected world. And I think we're in a similar place now with generative AI. But I think a lot what we're going to end up happening in the next maybe 5 years is that, like, as a consumer, I'm not going to care. I don't need to know anything about GPT or generative AI or neural networks or anything. What's going to end up happening is my expectation of software or anything I'm interacting with is that it's going to be AI powered, but I just won't know that it's AI
Mm.
powered. It's just like it becomes the default. It's like, of course it writes my email for me, or of course it automatically responds to this thing. Like, and anything that doesn't do that is going to feel really, really strange, and like it's like being like trying to interact with technology from like a Walkman or or something like that, or something where like it's not connected to the internet, like it's just, or it doesn't have a touch screen. Like all these things feel really foreign to people of a newer generation. And I think we're going to see the same thing essentially with some of this momentum around AI.
Yeah, I totally agree. I laugh sometimes when I think about, like, you can do more with a filter on TikTok than mainstream movies could do 25, 30 years ago. I mean, it's
Mhm.
amazing what we can do with what today is already just kind of basic AI, not even the advanced stuff, just, filters and that stuff. That it is an amazing time. And I would agree with you. We're on to something here that is foundationally changing. It is as big as, like, the internet or the cloud, maybe. Certainly Internet of Things, I think, is another one that has transformed, not in the way they initially thought, but it did transform things in absolutely fundamental ways. And so with that, we're basically out of time. Before we go, what's the best way for people to either reach out to or find some more information about some of the stuff that we've talked about today?
Sure. So if you want to contact me, you can find me on Twitter or on Facebook, or sorry, not Facebook, on LinkedIn. Just look up my name, Sean Falconer. And then if you want to learn more about GPT and also some of the things that we're doing at Skyflow in relation to data privacy and GPT, we recently launched a new product called Skyflow GPT Privacy Vault. And there's information on skyflow.com that you can look up, as well as a blog post written by our chief product officer that kind of goes into the details, both from like what are the concerns around GPT models in terms of privacy, and then how are we addressing it at Skyflow.
Awesome. Sean, thank you so much for being on the show today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
And this podcast is data leadership for everyone. But if you need some data leadership for you, I want to help. So send your questions to podcast@dl4e1.com, or my phone number is 773-888-2077 if you'd prefer to text or leave a voicemail. You can find subscription links and all our episodes at dataleadershipforeveryone.com. And until next time, be good to your data, be better to your business, and be best to each other. Now go make an impact.